Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Landscapes series. This is the final film that we're going to be screening for you today. And we will be screening the film that we have entitled, or that the filmmaker has entitled, Following in the Devil's Footsteps, which is a new vision, subtitled New Vision of Early Native Life. Our guest panelists today are three. We have Evan Pritchard, who is of Mi'kmaq descent. He's author of 18 titles of hardcover books, plus 36 self-published books. He's an adjunct professor and has taught courses in Native American studies at Marist, Vassar, and Pace. We also have, as a panelist, Dr. Fred Wiseman. He's the coordinator of the Vermont Indigenous Heritage Center, an Indigenous rights activist and an author of many scholarly and popular books on archaeology, ethnohistory, and ethnobotany. We had originally planned on having a third panelist who would have been Tim Mentz. He is of the Standing Rock Sioux of South Dakota. He was the nation's first tribal historic preservation officer from 1996 to 2008. Unfortunately, as you all know, there are issues with the pipeline out in Tim Mentz's region, and he sends his regrets that he cannot be with us today. He has a meeting about an upcoming court case that he has to attend, which is scheduled for today. So we hope him and Doug will have a chance for an online discussion sometime in the near future. So I'm David Brule. I'm the president of the Nolumbeka Project. And if you don't know, we are a nonprofit organization made up entirely of volunteers dedicated to providing the public with opportunities to learn about the history, life ways, and persistence of Indigenous peoples in our region. Please feel free to contact us with your questions about Nolumbeka and our projects at nolumbekaproject.org on Facebook or at our email, nolumbekaproject@gmail.com. We hope you're enjoying this series. We'd greatly appreciate your donations. We're all offering our services to you as volunteers in hopes of preserving our Indigenous landscape. But we need your donations. The filmmaker and the panelist, Doug Harris, are doing this on their own time and have devoted all of these past hours with you as volunteers. So we really need to find a way, you need to find a way to help support us and support the filmmaker Ted Timreck and Doug Harris. So please remember to give. We always begin our events with an acknowledgement. That acknowledgement is that we are all occupying and benefiting from Indigenous lands. The first peoples have lived here for tens of thousands of years in balance and reciprocity with the earth. The voices and spirits of those ancestors are still here in the air around us, and their descendants are still here among us. We must be thankful and continue to be thankful to this earth and to our fellow creatures with whom we share the wonderful gifts of our rivers, our forests, hills, and plains. We give thanks for all good things. We also want to take a minute to appreciate our two principal sponsors, the Karuna Center for Peace Building in Amherst. Karuna Center has an outreach that ranges across the planet to reach more than 40 countries, many of which have been affected by violence. Please have a look at their website. They do wonderful work in building peace at thekarunacenter.org, K-R-E-U-N-A, Karuna Center. And also a very strong thank you to the River Valley Co-op based in Northampton. This is, as you may know, a retail grocery business cooperatively owned by 11,000 community members. They specialize in local products and are committed to building a sustainable local food system and have been long-standing supporters of the Nolumbeka Project and other groups that work to preserve Native American historic and cultural sites. We are incredibly indebted to filmmaker Ted Timreck. He has been sharing with us his films over the past month and a half. He has been working in film since 1976, exploring and filming sites that will be and have been the focus of this series of films we will be presenting. Ted holds a research position in the associate program of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. He's been working with the Museum Arctic Studies Center since 1980. Ted Timreck has been breaking new ground with Doug Harris, as you'll see. Our friend Doug Harris, whom you will meet shortly, is the moving force behind efforts to locate ceremonial stone landscapes and preserve these sites as important parts of our cultural heritage and national treasure. Together, Ted and Doug have blended their scientific research methodology with indigenous insights, knowledge, and wisdom to provide us with a unique and remarkable body of work that crosses cultural lines. Truly groundbreaking, and we're truly thankful for all the work these two men have done. As I said, we have two guest panelists, Dr. Fred Wiseman and Evan Pritchard. You will meet them shortly, but now I'm going to ask you a couple of things. One is that if you do have questions during the film, you certainly can start recording them on the Q&A part so that our coordinator of questions and answers can begin getting that organized. If you have some really detailed questions about how to delve into preservation of sites you think you may know of, please hold on to that, because we'll have a considerable chunk of time to address that specifically. You probably have noticed that you have a closed caption option at the bottom, and you can always remove that if you do not wish. You see a small CC box at the lower right-hand screen. So please remember to donate. We need your help. We need to continue doing programs like this. I'm going to turn this over now to our filmmaker, Ted Timreck, who will take it from here. Thank you.
Various stone ruins of New England and suggested their native origin. In part two, we looked at the almost unknown native culture that may have been the source of this ceremonialism, the sea-adapted peoples who once lived along the Atlantic coasts and water systems of North America going back to the Ice Age. In part three, we saw how native voices, archaeological voices, and natural history voices could, as Jim Peterson said, quote, put their heads together and work through some of these perplexing mysteries. This is part four, and this is perhaps the most controversial of all the segments. There are three big topics in this that I'd like you to note as we get into it. The first is the discovery on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation of an extraordinary early culture that adds both dimensions and problems to our historical picture of indigenous peoples. The second is a segment about 19th century American artists who seem to have been deeply moved by Native America and whose works are rarely looked at together and in context. And third is the question of long distance set landscape alignment. In the Great Falls episode, we saw the relation of astronomical alignments like the solstice sunset to various sites in the Northeast. In this episode, we'll look at connections between ceremonial sites and landscape features on the ground, this has always been extremely controversial. It's hard to imagine why this is so, because the Mayans had precise landscape alignments. The Anasazi, way before the Mayans, did also have these alignments. And then later, the Midwestern mound builders had alignments that were very detailed. So why Northeastern peoples shouldn't have this same kind of tradition should be a surprise to us. But if the Hidden Landscapes series is meant to do anything, it is to shake the stereotypes of early Northeastern indigenous peoples that have been used to shape American anthropological science since colonial times. Now, one more thing. Many of you have heard us refer to our latest movie, which is still unfinished, that continues the hidden landscape research. From the questions that you have been asking after our screenings, it's clear that this is a knowledgeable and engaged audience, and we are very lucky to have you with us. I would like to try an experiment. Our next movie is in a fine cut stage. It has only been shown to the people who contributed their research, because I always do that to make sure they are comfortable with the way their ideas are presented. We've also screened it for a few additional scientists and a few foundation types, because we're still trying to raise the finishing funds. What I would like to do is to have an audience like yourselves as a focus group to offer feedback after viewing the movie, so we can tell what audiences are learning, what they think is interesting, what connections they might be making, etc. If you will send me an email, I will send you a link to access the video before we finalize it, and look forward to responses that you might offer. I can give you a very simple email address. I'll spell it for you. It's just TTIM, as in Mary, RECK@gmail.com. And also, I've been asked that for teachers or anyone else, you can download the Hidden Landscape programs on the Vimeo, which is listed on Nolumbeka's site. And you may use those for classrooms if you want to adapt some of these ideas to your own courses. So let me run the share screen system here, and we'll get started.
Just a reminder to put your questions and answers in the Q&A section. I just want to say that I'm very happy. We're all very happy that Evan Pritchard and Fred Wiseman could come back. Their last appearances were very popular and well received. And I especially want to thank Doug and Ted for this series and for opening our eyes to so many wonders, hidden landscapes, landscapes that were hidden in plain sight. So I will read the first question. Does anyone know where the Thomas Cole painting depicting the balanced rock on the mountain is located?
That was an illustration for Fenimore Cooper's book. It was literally painted for Cooper and put into his book. You know, if you go up to the Finger Lakes region where Cooper lived, you can find copies of posters of that in the stores up there. I don't know where the original painting is, to tell you the truth, but
there's the Thomas Cole House in Catskill.
Yeah.
You could check with that museum there, Catskill, New York.
Shutesbury is indeed destroying a culture in its acquisition of land. There are Native American burial places that have not been honored or respected, but rather built over so that the landowner can profit by leasing the land. Do you have any suggestions of things that we can do?
Register of Historic Places. And if in fact it gets acknowledged at the National Register of Historic Places, then the town has the capacity to create an ordinance which says that any site that is on the National Register shall not be impacted. The town has to do that, though. That's a town choice and a town procedure.
How do you feel about the systemic destruction of Native American culture? Through your deep study, what loss do you grieve most? What can be restored or reclaimed in our time, and by whom?
Whoa, that's pretty huge.
Mm.
Well, much of what is being impacted cannot be replaced. There are prayers that are integral to the creation of stone features, and we don't know the prayers. We don't know what issues prompted the ancient people to come together and pile those stones and make those prayers that prompted a call for balance and a call for harmony. So once they're gone, it might be that they are gone forever.
Well, another way of looking at it might be that, that what you have to do is think of it as the whole problem is like a pumpkin that has been smashed into 100 small pieces. And the question is, first of all, how does one find the pieces of the pumpkin? Secondly, how does one recognize, like in a jigsaw, how they go back together? And so, for example, one of the projects that we're working on with regard to calendrics is there are two remaining important ceremonies. The first is what we call the Forgiveness Day commemoration, which is the first new moon after the winter solstice that sets our agricultural calendar. There were about 5 distinct fragments of that ceremony. Some persisted in the Connecticut River Valley. Others were retained in the Abenaki language as recorded in the 1950s at Odanak. And there were other elements. And so one of the things that we've striven to do is to put these back together under the kind of oversight of the elders who still maintain that tradition. Another is the shooting fire ceremony, which occurs at the summer solstice, whereby good wishes of the attendees at the ceremony are all breathed into tobacco ties. The tobacco ties are then put in a communal fire where they are consumed. The essence of the wishes in the fire are transferred to a fire arrow that is then shot toward the sun to ask for a good harvest and good the rest of the year, basically. And so these are things that have been put back together, but they don't have, at this point, a sacred landscape element. In other words, one can put regalia, ritual behavior, music, and dance together. As we have done, now we're in our fifth year of this. The next stage that we're working on is working with basically Passamaquoddy elders and some other ways of and talking, trying to understand what the past was, to start moving toward bringing these back to sacred landscapes that exist in our homeland. So we're taking a kind of pragmatic approach from both a analytic, I guess you could say, viewpoint, plus with elders overseeing it to see if we can begin to put the pumpkin back together. And we're about maybe 15-20%, and that's enough for now.
Okay, I'd like to comment, I was thinking of it as a Jenga tower, you know, the game with all the wooden pieces that falls over, only half of it's fallen over, and those other pieces are lying around, maybe in the woods. And as we go on, it's more and more difficult to take these clues. And I like Fred's puzzle piece analogy, is that a lot of it still fits together and there's pieces missing. The longer we go, not preserving these landscapes, the harder it will be for, you know, descendants of native elders such as myself to figure it out. And I realize that I find when I go to a new site and I see stones, they don't always even immediately speak to me. Sometimes it takes a while, and I use, you know, tobacco to try to communicate with the spirit there, and suddenly something will become totally obvious to me that I may have walked by many times. And so it's for everyone to preserve the sites, even ones you're not sure about, because it may be obvious to someone who's also been working in this field, such as Ted or Fred or Doug, that you might not see at all. So just to preserve it until these pieces can be reconstructed. And then there's often a great understanding of the history that would otherwise have been lost. So we're at that Jenga tower moment where, like, we're really at the edge of losing that fabric of information. And Ted's films really help a lot to send this to a wide audience so that people will know that you just because it doesn't mean anything to you, you don't just throw it away or use it in your, you know, that stone in your fence or something.
Do you think there is a New England missing link that is under such great protection? It has some kind of blocking mechanism that only Indigenous people and others who are called can see the truth.
I don't think you can hide truth from anybody forever.
Well, let me comment. In New York, I'm in New York, and there's one particular site that is a stone star map, and there's a lot of people protecting that site and keeping it secret. And I'm not going to be the one to mess it up because there's no cement. It's just lying there. But if you understand the star map, it goes out for many miles in every direction. And so a stone construction that might seem to mean nothing, or the angle means nothing, but in terms of the star map, it could mean a lot. So that's the kind of thing that might be out there as a hidden key. But the fact is they're so vulnerable, and the consciousness of the American public is not ready to just automatically preserve these balanced stones and not say, oh, I can just push this over.
Is there still excavation going on at the Mashantucket Pequot Casino? And does the Sandy Hill excavation mean that there are remains of the settlement under the casino?
I suspect that the casino archaeologically was handled very carefully. Kevin McBride is nothing if not very, very thorough. He goes over it. He's talked more about how even when they've done their surveys, then they take it down just to make sure they haven't missed anything. So I suspect, I mean, where they've actually built the structures, I think they've looked pretty carefully. But as that shows, all around, you just have no idea where you're going to run into archaeology. And we should be aware of that.
Does the 90 degrees meeting of the two lines linking ceremonial sites have any significance, north-south directions?
Ted?
Well,
you want to tell him?
I don't know if I've never looked into what, and it's not my place to say it has significance unless if we follow the words of the medicine man, the Narragansett medicine man, Lloyd Runningwolf, you let the landscape speak for itself. And it takes a time. It's obviously taken a long time to let this happen. And it'd be foolish to say it doesn't. Whether it's actually 90 degrees, I mean, I suppose the numbers are there, but when you're looking at landscape, you can be as exact as ancient cultures could be, and we're finding that they could be much more exact than we ever imagined. And yet, it's probably different than the exactness that comes from astronomy. There's some kind of a difference between those two levels of computation. But I don't know of any particular thing, but you having noticed it is probably the first step towards whatever might happen.
Doesn't seem to be an exact right angle as far as I can see. That's my opinion. But there are two different lines that are aligned with a whole different set of factors. And the main one, we started with is like there's 5 natural sites along that line that humans didn't make, and then there's like 7 more or more that we know about that natives did make along that one line, the first one. And so those are all there, and that the other line is a whole nother set of things. So they don't necessarily have to be at a right angle. That's
Correct.
my opinion.
It's a good one.
I live in Amherst and am deeply moved by this increased knowledge of the landscape I love. Is there a way to share this film and others with some family members and friends who feel as I do?
Oh, I wish you would. Please do. If you go to the link on the Nolumbeka site, which is a Vimeo link to the rest of the movies, please, as I suggested, go get it. If you're teaching in school and you want even a portion of something to show to kids, please get it off the site. If you download it off the site, you can certainly show it in your classroom or to your family and what have you. Could only encourage you to do so.
And here's a question specifically for Evan. Can you work with those who are attempting to preserve stone prayers?
Well, I'm not sure what they mean. Not necessarily. I think one has to have a deep relationship that develops. And I think one of the first prayers you should have is to have a great spirit teach you how to pray. So I'll just say that if you can do that, then let's go to the second step after that. But pray to understand how to pray. I think you'll get a long way. It's not what necessarily you think. By the way, in sign language, to pray means to make medicine. Okay, that's a whole different concept of prayer. So you can understand that to make medicine with your words is a whole different concept than, say, praying to get a new car or whatever. It's a praying for communion and understanding, and often for thanks and asking forgiveness. I'll start there.
Someone would like your comments on the origins of Dighton Rock, which is not in this area, but.
Well, it's obviously very famous. It's been looked at for a long time. Petroglyphs there are many, many petroglyphs in lots of places. I think Evan probably has in this group, he might have a corner on the petroglyphs far more than me, but Dighton is one of those serious contenders.
Does anyone know if it has been perceived that there are earth energy lines or ley lines running along the aligned sites?
Oh boy. It's very difficult. One of the problems in getting to understand these things is the confusion that consistently pops up when you mix antiquarianism from different hemispheres or different places. Not that the world's people aren't related in their thinking, but the science of sorting things out and putting little boxes around things to help understand it it doesn't necessarily allow for easy comparisons. And I've just found over the years that if you take each instance of something in its own environmental situation and you look at it for what it is and not necessarily overlap for whatever reason you might have, you'll go farther and you'll be a little better off. either communicating to other people or even being satisfied for yourself. There has always been a strong, when I mentioned controversy, I wasn't kidding, the idea that Native Americans might somehow be related to British antiquarianism is a stopping position for many, many natives, for many more scientists, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have to get into that, but to once again, to go back to Lloyd Runningwolf, if you look at the landscape here and you try to understand it as best you can within your own range of understanding, that's all you can do for it. And to make other connections other than to try and lay out the narrative in a way that other people can understand, I don't think I can get to successfully. I can't make those kinds of overarching comparisons and still be effective, I think, in a communication way. Now, the other guests probably have even deeper thoughts about it than I do, but please go.
Yeah, Doug, love to hear from you.
Well, I think that to be a Welshman or to be a Frenchman analyzing things in Wales or in France, you may have a particular sensitivity to what is there. To be an Algonquin, you may have a very different sensitivity to what is here. And a ley line may be a reality, or it may be an attunement of one's personal sensibilities to the environment that the person is in. So it's difficult to say because a ley line becomes a system of trying to coordinate what different people feel about the land that they are on top of. Evan?
Oh, no, I'm looking to you for wisdom on this.
That's about it for me.
Sometimes we may come across a place that feels very special in the landscape, with or without visible features. We may also come across a place where it feels that something sad or frightening or destructive happened. Any thoughts on how best to address or bring healing to these places?
Oh.
Well, I'll take a crack at it. That's a very complex and deep question. There's a philosophy that I really find interesting that I learned many years ago. It's been called by some scholars as relational accountability. The idea is that even when you're doing something like if you're in the land and you're looking at an area or just walking over it, you're basically communicating with maybe one thing, like you're looking at a horizon. Well, relational accountability concept says that that's not exactly what's going on, that you are accountable not only to the horizon that you're looking at, but you're also accountable for the land that you're walking on, the ecosystem you're participating in, and all of those are accountable to you. In other words, there's a kind of a accountability ecology that goes on. And I find that thinking of things in that way, I really, you can't heal a place with any types of techniques that we should even begin to think about. But one of the things that you can do is understand that place might be asking you, or you might be feeling a necessity to be accountable. And so just a awareness that just why, if you're looking at one thing or you're doing one thing, you're actually accountable to everything that's around you. and you need to be aware of that. And that's the way that when I go into an area that might be a little sad or low energy, or another area that might be a bit hyper or high energy, that's the way that I just, oh, okay. And it's not necessarily sad. We might feel sad, but we don't really know. But just being aware of that accountability. That's one way of thinking about it. But there's 100 other ways.
I have a story. I was doing at a gathering with William Command way up in Canada. We're doing the local elders were gathering. We're doing a ceremony, and a bunch of Mayans and Kogis showed up from South America. And then they said to us, this is really great, but where are your land keepers? Why aren't you addressing them and bringing them in? And we didn't even know, like, well, okay, land keepers, what's that? So I got to talk to these elders and ask them about them. And then for the next 10 years was just trying to understand. And it seems like a whole lot of nations all over the, North and South America and Central America see and believe in these land keepers, which are ancestors who were living as native people hundreds of years ago and who made a ceremony as they were dying to honor and protect the land. And they would go to the very next level of clouds in the sky, so to speak, or the astral dimension from a very pure place, and to protect Mother Earth. And I've experimented with this and asking other people, well, can you see? And people seem to see them. And I'm not going to convince anybody here and now, but this is my experience with it. The land keepers are there to help with these situations, and how you reach them. Yeah, that's that's a pretty complicated thing, but you can open your hearts to them and whatever and see what happens. And also some of them still only speak their language, so I understand.
One of the early stories that was shared with me was that in ancient times, if a person was killed by an animal or by another human, the spirit energy of the place was marked by the spirit loss of that person. And that what the medicine people acknowledged was there was a need for ceremony, and that the placement of stones was used as a part of a prayer tradition to call on the Earth Mother through the prayer into the stone and the placement of the stone on the bosom of the Earth Mother, to call on the Earth Mother to reharmonize and rebalance the spirit energy of that place, because people found that if they went through that place, quite often very awkward things would happen, or very harsh or negative things would happen to them. And that was a result of an imbalance that was left, spiritual imbalance that was left in that place. And so the prayer was one to call forth the Earth Mother to reharmonize and rebalance the spirit energy in that place. That was shared to me as an example of what these stones might represent. They may represent many things, that included, but we need to recognize that we don't deal with spirit in the ways that we once did. We don't acknowledge spirit and its imbalances that can be caused by a harmful event or an out of balance event. We don't recognize that. We think that we can just bury someone and it's all over with. But the fact is that there may be a lot of spirit tending that needs to occur when someone is taken to death.
Are there alignments from sites to points on the horizon during the equinox, which is today, and solstice?
Yes. Byron Dix and Jim Mavor actually identified, they were very careful to think of equinoxes in their work. You can find it in Manitou. You can find it in one of our movies. There's a little segment that deals with an equinox, I believe, on the islands off Nantucket there. In general, for me, the idea to get across is that if all of the rest of North America and maybe South America, Central America and South America, if traditional peoples had these kinds of astronomical alignments, right down to Florida and the southeast coast of the United States, why is it possible? How could it be that we wouldn't have the same kind of behavior or tradition in the northeastern part of North America? And somehow science has dropped the idea that the people here could have done anything like alignments. And it's the older we get and the longer we work at this, the harder it seems for me to understand why you could call out a whole part of the country and a whole series of peoples and imagine that they are somehow ostensibly less than all the rest of the peoples in the hemisphere. Once you get over that hump, then these kinds of questions become much easier to get into and look for and ultimately to solve and bring us all back on an equal footing, which is what we desperately need when we're all talking about balance and harmony.
I'd like to acknowledge that we are very fortunate to have Ted Timreck show these films, make these films, because Ted Timreck was there with Mavor and Dix, when Mavor and Dix were identifying this whole approach to ceremonial stone landscapes being indigenous. So Ted, thank you for maintaining that continuity and bringing it forward through your films. Thank you.
Well, you're so very welcome. I mean, when you have a problem I think I took this on because cinematically, dealing with an issue like this, stones going from Phoenicians or colonial farmers and seeing them as native, I thought it was just about the hardest narrative problem I could ever tackle. To get anyone to pay attention to this possibility and then to run it all the way out to where we are today, offshore, looking for ceremonial sites under the ocean, that long progression of 40, 50 years is enough to keep anyone interested if you just stay focused on it. And it always gets more interesting. So you don't really want to stop this kind of research. And using the cinema is the way that you force yourself to make it understandable to many, many other people. We don't write papers that need to be peer reviewed by scientists and then put into small booklets that never get looked at. Not that there are huge crowds looking at these movies, mind you, but the attempt to put it into a form that everybody can understand. And for me to be able to cross the lines between scientists who may or may not agree with everything we've got in here, but do believe that what we're pursuing is very worthwhile, and at the same time work with Native people who want to cross that line and help the scientists get to that place. That's been a great honor, and it's actually a pleasure to work that way over a long space of time. So I don't need much in the way of thanks for doing this, just because it's way too interesting to imagine not doing it for at least that part of the life.
I think we also need to acknowledge Diane Dix for making this series happen, because Diane Dix is the wife of Byron Dix of the Manitou books. Byron Dix and Jim Mavor created Manitou with Ted Timreck by their side. And Diane, thank you very much for making this series happen. so that we have the opportunity to share with the public. And the public needs to be acknowledged because it's the National Historic Preservation Act that initially says that you, the public, the tribes, and the state have a responsibility to make sure that any federal project acknowledges the ancient and the likelihood that the ancient may be disturbed or destroyed by historic preservation being ignored when projects of a federal nature are developed. We need to acknowledge that, and you, the public, need to stand with the tribes, stand with the state, and stand against the destruction of these sites.
Yeah.
I'd
Well,
like, oh, go ahead.
oh, Fred, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow up with just saying how much I appreciate Ted and how he's helped me open my eyes. But one of the things that you need to remember is the elegance of the stone-built ceremonial landscape is just one manifestation of hideously complex and entirely unexplored culture in the Northeast. Unfortunately, much of it deals with burial goods. And so I can only deal with it in generalities, not individual items. For example, gouges, just a standard archaic or late archaic, early woodland gouge, okay, is bilaterally symmetrical with precision that is caliper based, maybe 3 to 8 thousandths of an inch. Bilaterally symmetrical. You try without a 19th century caliper to create that level of precision in a piece with bilateral symmetry. Then you get a boat stone. That's a kind of boat shaped thingy. We don't really know what they're used for, and even if we did, I probably wouldn't even think about telling you. But that is quadrilaterally symmetrical. Also, 2, 3, 2, 6, 10 thousandths of an inch. Okay, the precision of making that is fully equivalent to that of the precision of putting these lines down or a hideously complex stone structure. And then if we get into textiles, also from the burial record, there are twine textiles. And if anybody has ever, just look up twining or finger weaving. Right, only 2.5 miles from where I am, there's a repatriated shroud that has between 60 and 100 twines per inch. Okay, and it's about 9 feet by 9 feet. That is fully equivalent of a good-sized mound in terms of its complexity. It's made out of dog bane. I won't even get into the materials, but there's layers and layers and layers of complexity, including Ramat shirt being only 4.5 feet from Queen Conch shell from Jamaica in certain sites. There's, in terms of the trade systems and networks, and then even if we come up to the contact period, the whole Great Council Fire that stretched from Cape Breton Island to, quote, the shadows of the Rockies, with an area larger than the Roman Empire that nobody knows about because it wasn't the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. There are layers and layers and layers of hideously complex civilization here that only one of about 10 manifestations is that of stone-built landscapes. And as Norman Halliday said, I see what you mean, but I think we could turn that around and say, you have to believe it before you can see it. And the archaeologists deal with all of these things, and they're unwilling to recognize even the stuff that's sitting in on their lab shelves, what those things really mean.
I want to comment about the equinox. I think it's very important that we recognize that today is the equinox. It's a day of balance between light and darkness. And I want to suggest that people go out on days like this and actually go and experience the land, because I had one site that I went to And I looked at it, it looked like there was some kind of alignment of stones to channel the light of the vernal equinox sunrise. And looking at it, rather than go out and measuring everything, it was very complex. And so what I did was I just went back on the morning of the vernal equinox, and it was very simple, is that it did form that alignment. The sun came through in a more and more narrow focus. And then I stood before this strange barrow, like a pit. And at that moment, this golden intense light came through me, around me, and created my shadow. But in the barrow, it created a three-dimensional picture that matches the verbal, the oral tradition about what you are as a spirit. And it was just amazing. And it persisted for several minutes, like a kind of a shadow, like the shadow soul with a great light around it, just standing there in front of me. And you would never know that unless you were there right on equinox. So I think it's a really good idea. And what happens with these equinox sites, they don't seem to get as much attention. There's more of them, I think, than the solstice sites, but they tend to get overlooked. So you have to go out there and then write into Nolumbeka and say, we got a site, and they'll figure out how to preserve it.
I'm going to read two more questions. We're getting low on time, and then David is going to introduce a special guest who we have, and he and Doug are going to be making an announcement for everybody. Here's the first question. Oh, and I would like everybody to have a chance to have a few final words. What have you been able to learn about sea travel, navigation, and relationship to the sea in the oldest cultures you found in the East and North?
That one's thrown to me, I'm sure, here. And what I can suggest is please take a look at our next movie, because it is all about just that. I believe if you begin to understand how important adaptation, the maritime revolution and adaptation to the ocean is for the cultures who do live at the edges, you will see how depth and precision work its way into a civilization. And that's sort of the theme of the next movie that I cited earlier in the introduction. And someday we will probably come back to a venue like this and show it. It's just not finished yet, but it's getting close. And if you have a chance to look at it, as I mentioned before, please do. But that's just a phenomenally important question that is not completely apparent until you go deep into the research to see it. And nobody expects that to be Eastern Native American Indian. And that's the big hill we have to climb up in order to get to some kind of equality here with the stereotypes.
Well, I think you need to add to that, Ted, that we don't understand what happened during glaciation. We don't understand that water was extracted from the oceans by the glaciers, and that the continental shelf became void of water, and the people who were along the coast went down onto the continental shelf and did their hunting. They hunted the big game animals, they hunted the small animals, they hunted the walruses, the seals. They hunted all that was along that coastal area, and the remnants of their presence on the continental shelf is still there. It may not be in memory, but it may be in archaeology.
Thanks for adding that. That's the solid side of our next piece of work.
It strikes me that modern culture, with all its scientific knowledge and technology, is not nearly as advanced as ancient culture's deep knowledge. It feels significant that you are finding this scientific evidence at this time. How do you envision these discoveries advancing modern culture?
Well, I'll make a little comment. You mentioned in this film traditional ecological knowledge, which is a wonderful, fairly newly minted phrase, and that I think is very important. And I was talking about that in a talk up in Canada to the government. And I said, well, we should have a department here in Canada of a traditional ecological knowledge department. And afterwards, somebody came up and says, well, I'm the guy who would do that, and I'm going to do it because I like what you said, and I'm going to ask the government here in Canada. And he went and did it. He created a department of traditional ecological knowledge. And what they're finding is that, you know, there's the scientific knowledge and there's the ecological knowledge, and you can't expect them to exactly match up. But by understanding one, you understand the other better. And that's the way they approach it. That's why I suggested they approach it. And Robin Wall Kimmerer really wrote the valedictorian speech on this in an article in a magazine, science magazine, and then gone on to written some very good books. And that's just one little part of it.
I'd like to add that in all these years of meeting people who discover sites, whether it's their backyard or whether they're in the forest, whatever it is, and have a feeling for any of these ceremonial stone sites. I have never met anyone who had a sense of a ceremonial stone site who wasn't a very devoted environmentalist. And one of the things I think can happen with the knowledge of these sites is that it brings an emotional facet to the issue of environmentalism. Yes, killing ourselves environmentally and wiping out civilization and humanity with bad environment is certainly an emotional element. But we've been dealing with the environmental problem for decades now. And the one thing that seems to be missing to me is, aside from terror and fear, is a true emotional commitment to the issue. And one thing I've noticed in a small way with the research into these stones and these sites and native tradition in general, from an outsider's perspective completely, is that there's a link between a sense of the environment and a sense of the emotion of a ceremonial site. And that actually supplies a form of emotion to the issue of environmental awareness that I think has been missing. It's all been terror so far. We need a slightly different movement towards an understanding, and that can shift us more easily. And like I say, I've never met anyone who was aware of ceremonial sites who wasn't an avid environmentalist at heart.
Thank you. So if each of you would like to share just a few closing words, we'll turn this back to David and our announcement at the end of the program.
I think it's important to acknowledge that, first of all, there were 4 regional tribes, federally recognized tribes, who took it upon themselves to begin the process of reaching out to towns, reaching out to the public, and bringing them in to the protection of ceremonial stone landscapes. That was Pequot, Mohegan, Wampanoag tribe of Gehedequina, and the Narragansett tribe. And what is now happening is that those 4 tribes and the memorandums of understanding that they established with towns have now begun the process of turning that effort over to the United South and Eastern Tribes, which is the organization of which they are all members. And the executive director of the United South and Eastern Tribes has agreed to work with a local attorney in Amherst and initiate the process of carrying the multiple property listing forward as a device that towns and the public will be able to use at the National Register. And what it does is that a multiple property listing creates, as with a,
Doug,
yes,
excuse me, I just wondered if you want to wait and talk to everybody about that with Peter also. So can we just have some closing words and then get on to your announcement?
my words are closed.
Thanks, sorry.
Okay, well, I guess I'll go next. I just want to reiterate my great fondness for Ted Timreck and all of you. Over these years, we've been on a really interesting roller coaster travel to try to convince, I don't know whether convince, just create an environment within which scholars and the public in the Northeast and the far Northeast can understand that there was, and perhaps still is, a very interesting and part only very smallly understood civilization in this neck of the woods. Thank you.
I saw this film last night and I stayed up doing some research on that fabulous discovery about the Sandy Hill, which, because again, Ted Timreck's films are bringing out. And so I want to share this for the public benefit, for Ted's benefit, because we haven't talked. But there is a group called this Sebenak group that Harrington studied extensively. He was the father of modern archaeology, if you remember, and he spent a lot of time on this. And he believed that the Shinnecock people today are the direct descendants of the Sebenak, who formed on Long Island after the collapse of Orient Point around 763 BC. So we have this incredibly ancient kind of maritime culture. The Orient Point had a spear point in the shape of a fish that, you know, has hydrodynamic properties. They're very advanced, and they believed strongly in alignments. They had alignments for everything. Well, the Sebenak didn't have that, but they are not that far, about 18 miles from Orient Point to the site you're talking about. But also the Shinnecock had developed this, to the greatest extent, this is the duck decoy. And, you know, Sumner, Martin, Charles Martin Bunn made the greatest of the carved duck decoys of wood, but they evolved out of bull reed duck decoys. And they also made boats. They made, the Sebenak people made huts 20 feet across out of those bull reeds, and they made pits everywhere for multiple purposes. And they also used those white quartzite stones. And those white quartzite stones come from the Harbor Hill moraine on northern shore of Long Island, and only some of them would reach the Connecticut shore. So there's some connection. Plus the Sebenak sites that Harrington explored, a lot of them were near Ledyard and not just on Long Island. So you find about 3 miles from the canoe place, that great canal that nature provided for the Shinnecock, 2 or 3 miles away was where a lot of these Sebenak sites are, but some of them were over on the other side in Connecticut. And so there's lots of parallels there between these two. Now the Sebenak don't reach their peak until 1000 BC or so, AD, excuse me, 1000 AD. But we see there's, this is a known Algonquin culture, and the Shinnecock are recognized. And so there's a continuity there that I think hardly anyone knows about. But I think that as you're going along and looking at this ancient culture that is surprising and unprecedented in our knowledge, that the fact they're on a swamp using the reeds is a key, and the white quartzite, to link them to the Sebenak and therefore to the Shinnecock and perhaps other tribes. But they were sedentary, they weren't nomadic, and the Sebenak stayed in the same place, had very highly organized villages, and we're very, how you say, civilized in an Algonquin sense. So I just wanted to make sure I said that.
Thank you. For my part, I would just like to thank our audience. The questions you've had over these weeks are really valuable, and to me, they reflect an understanding of the potential of what we're trying to do here, and that is It really feels good for making it all worthwhile. And you know, if I could ever get a focus group like this audience, we could go very far in trying to understand how these communications will work for larger and larger audiences. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate your being out there and taking this in and giving us back this kind of information about what you care about. So thank you.
Good. I guess it's up to me. Here we go. Well, the thanks are going all around. So of course we want to thank the people who contributed so much time, Ted and Doug and Fred and Evan. But this whole series has been building to some really important steps. How to take the next step. What is the next thing that we could do to really protect the sites that we know are in our own towns or that we may come across? So we have really the good fortune to have attorney Peter Vickery here, who has volunteered his services at least to help us with what process we should follow locally or in relation to the National Registry of Historic Places. And so no one better to talk about that than Doug Harris and attorney Vickery. So I'm going to turn that over to the two of them right now, and they will share some of a potential process that you could follow.
I'd like to applaud attorney Vickery for stepping forward and saying this series has so impacted me that I'm willing to step out and become a part of its process. So Peter Vickery, thank you, sir, very much for your willingness to jump into the fray with us. And the United South and Eastern Tribe, the executive director, Kitchke Carroll, welcomes you to the process and looks forward to becoming a partner with you in reaching out to the National Register of Historic Places to begin to get these ceremonial stone landscape sites placed on the National Register. Peter Vickery, take it away.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you, David and Diane and Ted, Fred and Evan and the Nolumbeka Project in general for this extraordinary and in so many different ways historic work, which is of such vital importance. And thank you for welcoming me and providing this opportunity to be part of something that is very clearly needed right now. There is room and a very clear need for a local legislative remedy. And in fashioning that, I know that many people will want to be involved. A local legislative response in order to safeguard spiritual landscapes and waterscapes, including ceremonial, monumental stone structures. And so in fashioning that local response going forward, if you're interested in participating, if you have some knowledge of, or even just an interest in local legislative drafting, in helping create a local bylaw or ordinance, and by the way, bylaw and ordinance are essentially the same thing. In Massachusetts, cities have ordinances and towns have bylaws. That's the only distinction. If you have an interest in that, or you know of a place that is in need of protection, please contact the Nolumbeka Project. And Diane, I believe, or David will let you know how to do that. So those are my very brief remarks. And I just want to say again how very grateful I am for the work of the Nolumbeka Project, for everyone you've seen today, and for those of you who, like me, have been watching and listening. Thank you.
Attorney Vickery, thank you, because what we've all needed is the voice of the law to come step forward and say, I will help you craft what you need. The United South and Eastern Tribes recognizes that we took the process, the 4 tribes took the process to the door of where it needs to go. And that door was the multiple property listing. And like a red barn of Vermont, once the state identifies what a red barn of Vermont is and it gets registered at the National Register, then nobody has to go back and repeat the whole process of applying. They just need to say, like the red barn that you've already dealt with. Well, the ceremonial stones are the same way. The multiple property listing will put them in a position at the National Register so that the application form can be a fairly brief one. But what we have to have happen is the United South and Eastern Tribes has to reach out to the National Register and get them to polish that process so that it will work well for the people of the Northeast. And not only the Northeast, because the ceremonial stones are all across the country, Atlantic to Pacific. The tribes, Atlantic to Pacific, use stones in a ceremonial fashion. And I'm sorry that Tim Mintz could not be here today, because one of the things that he would have talked about is how in the Dakotas, they utilize ceremonial stones as well, and that they look forward to participating with us and with you in taking this to the National Register. What Nolumbeka plans to do is to, all of you who have signed in and have given your email addresses as a part of the registration process, you will be communicated with the next steps for ceremonial stone landscape work that Attorney Vickery and the United South and Eastern Tribes will organize. So we look forward to working with you in the years to come.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, everybody, for this information. I do believe that from this point forward, we will be stepping up to take an active role in this. Again, as Doug said, get in touch with the Nolumbeka Project, or we will send you the next steps as we get our information from Peter and others like Doug. So I'd like to say, I put in a plug for Doug and others. The National Registry of Historic Places has an impact. The subject of the first film that Ted shared with us involved the ceremonial stone hill at the Turners Falls Airport. That was really the test case. It was there was some highs and some lows. It could have been disastrous, but the tribes, especially Doug, took it all the way to Washington, D.C., and was able to convince the authorities, the advisory board of the National Historic Preservation Act. So this can be done. It does work. That hill is now protected, and you could do the same thing in your town, but we have to take those steps and we have to do the work. So we will be in touch with you, and Attorney Vickery is going to be working on prototypes and protocols, and we'll share all of this as soon as it's ready. It is a work in progress, but we're taking it on. So thank you very much for attending. It's been a wonderful, I don't know how many hours, 12, 13, 14 hours of film and talk and questions. So from the Nolumbeka Project, we really want to thank you. Please keep us in mind with donations. We want to be able to support Ted with his future films. He's got a fantastic one in the works. We've seen short takes of it. It's just going to be excellent. So, but we need financial help to help Ted do that. So please keep us in mind. And after that, Go outdoors, like Evan says, and enjoy the equinox. It's a beautiful day. Goodbye, all. Thank you for attending.